conference. And I'm super thrilled to have Dr. Chaseten Remillard join us. Chaseten is quite actively involved in supporting the Center for Crisis and Risk Communications and the work that we do here. He does fun things like emails me and says, "Hey, Dr. Coombs is visiting the university. Get your butt out here and meet." Right. So a connector, a smart, brilliant, invested. This is on the sheet. I'm reading. You sent me this. Yeah, and so just
Not stylish. I thought stylish was at the front there.
Yeah. Just a dear friend, and we adore your support of the Center for Crisis Risk Comms and the work that's being done both academically and practically. So I'll just read your bio because it's here so that our guests know who the heck you are. So Chaseten is a communications scholar who's very interested in questions of social and environmental justice. He has expertise in visual and professional communications. His research includes topics as varied as homelessness, artists, hockey art, and the Alberta oil sands. And just for fun, shark films. Despite his eclecticism, he consistently interrogates how images gain and transmit meaning and how these meanings serve to reinforce particular ways of seeing ourselves and the world around us. Currently, Chaseten is completing a book on the visual communication of homelessness in the Canadian press. He is so happily married to his wife, Tanya, a proud father of 3, and is thrilled to be a friend of Ben Morgan.
It's true.
Remillard teaches communications at Royal Roads University, University of Calgary, Mount Royal University. He's been nominated for a University of Calgary Teaching Award. He's also instructed at international colleges in India, Costa Rica, as well as designed and ran a conflict resolution course in Montenegro. He and his wife have started a small communications consultancy which specializes at coaching applicants into professional medical programs. And he's earned a joint honors BA in history and English literature from McGill, and then completed his MA and PhD in communications studies at the University of Calgary. For both graduate degrees, he was a recipient of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Canadian Graduate Scholarship and was a nominee for the Governor General's Academic Gold Medal Award. Essentially, the work that you do focuses around doing good things. And that's why we love you, and that's why you're here. And so we're so thrilled to give you the screen and the mic and and also I just have to say again, Chaseten, thank you for moderating the panel discussion yesterday with Dr. Cavello, Dr. Hinch on Dr. McLennan. That was just inspiring. Retrospectively, I wish we had a scheduled 90 minutes for that. That would have been great. But sure appreciate you taking that on. That was a great gift. So
I really appreciate the invitation to do that, and it was really fun to do it and to be part of it. So thanks, Ben, and thanks for that really very flattering introduction. And I hope I can live up to everything that you've put forward there. I would like to say that today I'm presenting. And also, I just want to say thanks to Jeff and to Megan and everyone else back there who's helping make everything run really smoothly for us yesterday, and I'm sure going as well this time around. So yeah, it's a great pleasure to be part of this this conference because I think what's happening right now is one of those things where even if you're not a bread and butter communication scholar or practitioner, you're starting to recognize the importance of communications in a scenario like what we're all living through right now. And I think part of what I'm offering today is admittedly not fully researched, nor is it fully formed. It's really just, I think, to try to broach an important question about how the current media environment creates new challenges for the communication of risk and crisis communications. And like Ben said, I come to this sort of in highways and byways. I studied, most of my work is in images. And so how I sort of started to get interested in crisis communication was that a few years ago, I was looking at the images of the Fort McMurray fires, which if you were not from Alberta, were sort of the equivalent of what happened in Oregon this year. They were just sort of unbelievably large fires. The kind of the oil center, the economic engine of Alberta, near Fort McMurray, with the oil sands, were somewhat threatened. The city of Fort McMurray needed to be evacuated. And it happened, I think, within a month of a new leadership change. Premier Notley had just come to power. And so a colleague of mine, Sheridan McVeigh, and friend as well of Ben, Sheridan, and I, we looked at the sort of disconnect that we saw between what the political and organizational communication was around the fire and what the story of the fire was if you looked at the images. And since that point, I've really been interested in this growing sort of gap between what would otherwise be sort of classic, very good crisis communications, delivery of key messages on television, on news conferences, and so on, which Premier Notley was doing, and the unruly, uncontrollable kind of eyewitness, constantly shifting, full with rumor and conspiracy narrative that exists on social media. And so when COVID comes around, and we're looking at sort of an infodemic, as some people are calling it, right, where we're not only confronting the fact that we're addressing the uncertainty of a virus that we as humankind haven't experienced before, but we are actually dealing with we're fast forwarding in many ways, from the point of view of communications, we're fast forwarding a lot of trends that have been occurring. We've all of a sudden now, everyone moved to home offices. We're more and more reliant on the internet. We start to see gaps in our ability to determine what is truthful and valid information and legitimate sources. We start to see the polarization that has been occurring over the last few years, partly because of social media, get even more deeply rooted. So we're seeing the pandemic just sort of puts everything into this huge pressure cooker. And I think part of the fallout of that is this interesting generational divide that occurs every time there's sort of a rollover of generations in terms of power. But we start to see this sort of generational divide between the boomers, the Gen Xers, and then sort of the millennials and the Gen Zers, and the media is sort of playing up these differences and reinforcing these differences. And someone who's taught undergraduate for the last 7 years or 8 years, I've noticed that a lot of undergrads have taken up the study when they come to their sort of final projects and so on, taken up the study of looking at why there is a sort of disconnect within the workplace between different generations. And so there seems to be a kind of like a perfect storm here, from a variety of different angles as to why maybe we're perceiving, as different demographics, we're perceiving the pandemic differently. And so this is really just a kind of a foray into that, and to talk and to kind of start the conversation about what are some of the reasons why that might be, what are some of the challenges, what are some avenues of perhaps overcoming that, and so on. So most of us are aware of the fact that over the last couple of months, there has been a demographic shift in terms of infection rates. And so this has been noted not just in local sort of cases, but more generally across, let's say, Canadian infection rates, or in the United States. And we start to see that the infection rates really are increasing, although hospitalizations are not at the same level as they were earlier in the pandemic, but hospitalization, infection rates amongst younger adults between 20 and 39 are higher. Right. So as of October 4th, from Statistica, here, is that about, 18% of adults between 30 and 39, and then higher than that for, and then 15% for cases that are between 30 and 39, and 18% for those who are between 20 and 29, and those represent the first and second most highest demographics of infection. So, this has been, and again, anyone who's watching or reading news, this becomes a kind of like continual fodder of debate of like, why aren't Gen Zers and millennials taking COVID seriously? And what we hear about these parties, and we hear about the sort of the house parties and all the nightclubs, and we get this sense that perhaps there is an issue or a problem with the understanding of what COVID represents as a risk from these demographics, and I think what might be of interest to consider right off the bat is, but what risk are we actually measuring, and like what do we mean by risk? And I think this is a really interesting and important question. We can have this as a debate or a discussion down the road, is that risk in itself is something that's, it's socially constructed. We of course, there's obvious inherent biological reactions to risk. We see something that's risky in our mind, or dangerous in our mind. We get spikes of adrenaline or whatever, and our capacities change in some ways. But really, what is considered to be risky behavior, if you look at it from that perspective, is quite different, and differs between time and generation and context, right? So, simple things like smoking 75 years ago wasn't considered a risk, right? Like, we're not thinking of smoking as being, in fact, again, as the sort of urban legends go, doctors are prescribing smoking as a mechanism to clear out the lungs, right? So as our knowledge changes, and as our society and culture change, what we consider to be risky behavior, or what we consider to be risk, changes as well. And if we allow for that understanding of risk to be sort of more malleable or plastic, then we also have to acknowledge that perhaps different positionalities, or different contexts, lived contexts, are going to yield different understandings of what risk is. So from a person's perspective who's 80 years old, living in a long-term care home, COVID represents a very real health risk. But for somebody who's healthy in their 20s, the risk of COVID is likely not to be really a true health risk. I mean, there are, of course, potentials that we don't know, and everyone's biology is different. But normatively, when we look at that, the danger of COVID in younger populations, it is not as grave, and the mortality rates and the serious infection rates are different. Now, again, as we get more information and studies come out, we might see that there's long-term impacts to COVID infections in youth that show up maybe in their 40s and 50s, because we know that it impacts the body in different ways at that time. But currently, right, we know that if we just take a base measure of whether or not you're likely to end up on a ventilator, if you're 20 years old, you have a lower percentage chance of that happening than if you're 80. And so if we look at risk then from the point of view of younger adults, and this is from Pew Research, you know, the risk is different. The risk is more economic, the risk is more emotional, and the risk is more of like a everyday sort of job disruption. So when we talk about COVID risk, I think we have to be clear about what we're actually talking about. And I think for most of the media that I consume, and again, I'm not offering a scientific discussion here because I haven't done the proper research to be able to offer that. But just my observation is that most of the time when we talk about risk in the public sphere right now, what we're talking about, and we have been talking about for a long time, is the actual physical risk. And so when we talk about, and now the economics is starting to show up, and now the emotions is starting to show up, but those things obviously were present previously, and they've always sort of played a minor chord. And so I think one of the things that we think about then, if we narrow the focus and we say, okay, what we're really talking about is whether or not younger populations are heeding health warnings or getting good communications around what it means to do and proper preventative actions to stop the spread of COVID. Oftentimes, if that's what we're looking at, oftentimes from a communications perspective, we have certain assumptions about what professional communications and what crisis communications can do, and oftentimes it's about messaging, right? And that there's sort of deeply rooted assumptions around the audience when it comes to messaging. But I would suggest that, and as again, from my perspective of studying various different approaches to how theoretically communications work, a large bulk of them focus on the idea of getting the message correct. And once you get the message correct, you'll be able to influence and impact behavior, right? So it's about understanding audience to the extent to which then you can position the message in a way that results in the effect. And so what that means is that there's sort of like an idea that the message is the core area to focus on. And we can talk about whether or not maybe that's the best place to look at how to build effective risk or crisis communication, is to look at the message, because it might be better to be looking at the specifics and even the micro specifics of where that message is landing, to have a better understanding of whether or not that message is going to be effective. But early on, even when we start talking about communication theory, early on there was hesitancy about the idea that the message was the sole inflector of action, and so probably you've heard of two-step flow, and Katz puts forward this idea of two-step flow, which essentially says it's not just the message, but it's also who's delivering you the message. And so we've talked a lot about trust, and we've talked a lot about integrity of information, and part of that plenary yesterday that the conference hosted with Dr. Hinshaw and Dr. Covello and Dr. McLennan was discussing about the role of the communicator to instill sort of a level of trustworthiness, that if leaders in positions like BP, as Dr. Covello, if you were on the session yesterday, Dr. Covello says, the head of BP, when he makes a statement that clearly says that what's most important to him is the impact on his personal freedoms or on his own personal life, what that does is it downgrades all of the rest of his messages as being inauthentic or less impactful, because we doubt the sincerity of that, right? And so this is what even back to Aristotle, Aristotle makes that claim, and he says that the ethos of the speaker, right? The ethos of the speaker is as important and of an influencer as to all the other elements that might be there. We have to trust and believe the goodness and the truthfulness of the speaker in order for us to actually believe that. So two-step flow brings this into this scenario. In other words, it matters who's giving you the information, and that message then will hopefully have more impact if you have someone who's giving you good information from that point. And so the problem that this model puts forward now, or let's say the complication, if we don't want to be negative about it, but the complication or the challenge or the nuance that happens now is that we don't just have a situation where we can go and hold a press conference and in that room have the 4 or 5 major networks there that is distributing information, right? And that we can choose our leader appropriately and school them and tell them. We're out of that situation in which information is quarantined, to use a sort of a timely word, but quarantined within controlled networks of distribution. We just don't have that anymore because of digital communications. And so what we are experiencing now, right, is what Dr. David Terrace, is calling media shock. And I think this is a great turn of phrase to think about it, because if we think of like the media ecology as sort of, or as an organism, or it's going into some kind of form of shock right now. We are seeing tremendous change in the way in which media institutions exist and whether or not they'll actually be around, right? And as we understand them previously, right? So one of the things that Dr. Terrace says is that the ability of individuals to alter the top-down flow of information and create their own highly customized worlds is a characteristic of media shock. In other words, we can choose what we want to view. We don't have to just watch channel 6 from 6 till 9. We have options, right? And not only do we have options, but we have more options than we've ever had before. We can also produce, alter, reschedule, store, comment on any media experience at all, and based upon our preference and circumstances. In other words, we're much more interactive with what we view and see than we've ever been able to be before. Our media choices are becoming fragmented and customized and personalized, and so you hear these terms like media silo or siloed or echo chambers or a house of mirrors, right? So Dr. Cavello spoke yesterday of confirmation bias, right? So as we customize and personalize our own media environments, and as big data does that for us and chooses things for us that we like, what we end up hearing is just our own voice. It's like an echo chamber. We get it back to us, reverberated back by the internet. Anyone who's done that, Google search for any kind of illness, all of I think I might have, and as soon as you do that, you're echo chambering back and reaffirming whatever you might feel like you have. But then you go to a doctor and they're like, no, don't worry about it, right? But the way that the internet works is no matter what small community or small point of view that you may have, it's amplified because it in your town of 1,000 people, it might only be you, but there's many towns of 1,000 people out there, which means there's many yous or your viewpoints out there that then can find each other. And so this customization and personalization allows for connections, good connections, but also bad connections, right? The other thing is that these older institutions of newspapers, traditional media, conventional TV, cable, they're at the straining point. We're on the verge of having no or real newspaper industry, no real conventional television network, no real cable anymore. I mean, we're not far off from that. And, as people recognize that they're able to get a lot of their entertainment, and again, the pandemic has sort of sped this up. Why would we pay a monthly subscription for cable as sports go and are starting to stream online, and we can get them through our personal devices hooked to the internet? Why would we ever subscribe to the sports package on cable? So if you look at the rates of how many people have cable, people have cable if they're older than 45. So if you ever want to know how old somebody is, and you can't really put your finger on it, you just have to ask them a very simple question. You say, do you have cable? And if they have cable, they're over 45, statistically speaking. And I do this all the time in my undergrad classes. The only people who put up their hand in undergrad classes who have cable are people who live on their own or it's included in their rent. That's it. So if you're younger and you're admitting you have cable, you're probably sending the message that you can't afford to live on your own, or you're maybe in a cheaper apartment setting and you don't own a home. Because if you own a home and you're younger, chances are not putting cable in. That's just, again, statistically the reality, right? So these also create situations which new genres show up, like YouTube. So YouTube now, if you look at somebody like PewDiePie, and if you don't know who that is, is for a long time was one of the top YouTubers and move platforms now. But if you look at somebody like that, the amount of people who are subscribed to that individual, and he plays video games and makes comments on video games, is like equivalent to like how many people watching the Super Bowl. Like, so we're talking audience numbers on these channels, that are just this unbelievably big, right? Bigger than we've ever seen. And what's the number one thing that young people want to be when they grow up now? They want to be an influencer. So we're talking new genres. We're talking like, if you were to say right now at 12-year-old, you ask them, what do you want to do? Chances are they would be like, I want to be a TikTok influencer. Most of us wouldn't even think that was a real job, but you can do it. So these new genres, these new platforms, these new ways of getting information tells us really three things about media shock and its impact. One, audience choose media content. In other words, they're not given it anymore. They're choosing it. Number two, because we choose the media content, we therefore choose the opinions we hear, right? The news that we read and the shows that we watch. And an interesting difference between people who are under 40 and people who are over 40 is that people under 40, when they were asked about the importance of the internet, whether or not the internet is essential during the pandemic, their numbers are like yes, 65, 75% of people who are under 40 say the internet is essential. It's an essential service during the pandemic. People over 40 are not thinking that as much, right? They might think it, but not as much. And so we can therefore also broadcast our own ideas and our own personal network. So we're not in a two-step flow anymore. What we're in, this is multi-step flow. And if you look, it's not, it might be small on your screen, but you see you have member of target audience, mass media, opinion leader or influencer, and everyone is connected to everyone else. Everyone can speak back and forth. And if you don't think that influencers influence mass media and of course they do, right? Of course they do. Look at Steve Bannon, right? So what that means from the point of view of getting messages out in crisis or in risk situations is that we have a more complicated playing field, right? And a lot of you practitioners and people who are living this every day know this, right? You need to now not just hold the press conference and the media events, which is that arrow that's going to the mass media. You also have to think about targeted social marketing and using analytics and leveraging analytics so that a message lands directly from you without any mediator to the target audience that you're trying to get, and you hope that they just don't fast forward it, right? And then you also have to look for ways in which you can leverage and call upon opinion leaders that are outside of what we would call like the traditional media. And we would say something like the example from BC where Ryan Reynolds and Seth Rogen cut kind of some funny little short videos that they hope to go viral, that were speaking about how, you know, you're killing Ryan Reynolds' grandmother and so on, right? So the need for organizations to be able to, and typically government organizations, but any organization to send the message is now just not about having a good media event or having a good press conference. It's about thinking about how can we target and create good, snappy, interesting marketing or social marketing that we have to use and have in-house or at least contracted out experts on how to use social media platforms effectively and the analytics to get that. So that should be a line in our budgets, because we can't just rely on the media. Nobody's going to sit down and watch on an Instagram a review of a press conference from a chief medical officer. As great as Dr. Hinshaw is, I just don't see a 15-year-old watching that on a TikTok video, right? So you have to understand the platform, and therefore you have to understand the analytics, and you have to understand what makes something interesting on that platform. And you also have to look for opinion leaders. And I would suggest that although Ryan Reynolds and Seth Rogen are good opinion leaders, there needs to be an elevation of and not a dismissal of the types of content that younger adults are consuming. There has to be a recognition that it's not just about getting movie stars to say the same thing as health professionals. It's about getting people who can communicate and who are respected influencers amongst that target audience. And so there may be a hesitancy to go to certain areas of the internet and recruit people who like someone like PewDiePie, maybe not that person, but someone like that you as someone have never ever heard of, but has an important following and a large following. That might be an area where you have to look. Now, there's obviously dangers, and I mean, there's dangers because, like Dr. McLennan said yesterday, government communications is very risk adverse. It doesn't want to relinquish control of its message, especially during this kind of situation, to people who might then go off message. So it's kind of a catch-22, right? So there's the multiple points of entry. I think the other thing that we have to recognize is that we are now in a attention economy. I think I agree with the move away from calling this an information economy. It's not an information economy. We've got a lot of information, right? We've got way too much information. We have to slow the information down somehow, which is why the influencers are there and the media is there to curate, right? This word curation is becoming a really popular way of understanding, right? People are making selections, informational selections for us. That's why you follow somebody on Twitter, is because you look at them as somebody who's filtering all that information and saying, hey, if you only read 4 articles in the next week, these are the 4 that you should read, because it's information overload. It's like that Weird Al Yankovic movie way back in the day where you drink from the fire hose. If you know what I'm talking about, you get the metaphor, but the water just comes out of the fire hose so fast, there's no way that you can get any kind of water into your mouth. And so we're in an attention economy. So even though Fraser Health, and I applaud them for doing this, they create a Twitter account or a TikTok account. But look at this. There's nobody who they're following, and there's only 88 followers. Now, granted, this was a screenshot from earlier in the year, and this account might have more followers now. But in terms of TikTok, this is equivalent to my TikTok channel. It has zero influence on anyone right now. So it's not just a matter of being on the platform and translating your message from the press release to another platform. You have to think about the way of getting the attention of people who are on that platform. And that's not an easy thing to do, right? So like Michael Goldhaber says, information is not scarce, but attention is. We've moved from a material-based economy to an intention-based economy. In other words, it's everything that social media does, everything that these platforms do is to hold our attention. This creates problems of rabbit holing, because the more we're interested in something, they have to up the game. And we can have a discussion about how that process works too. But the more you watch something, the more likely you're going to get more and more of the same, and more of the same gets boring. So they have to up the ante, so it gets a little bit more racy or controversial or combative or whatever it is. And then they test it. They're testing waters. The algorithms are testing waters to see which way you're going to go, and then they give you more of the same. And the more you're on that platform, the more money they make from you, right? So the attention economy is something, we only have so much attention. We can only look at so many things. And for a lot of people, a press conference about risky behavior is not something that they're interested in looking at. So how do you overcome attention, the attention economy? Well, one way that you can think about it is perhaps looking at what are the criteria that makes compelling content on social media. And one of the most important elements of compelling content on social media is a sense of authenticity. So this comes up over and over again, and for any one of you who's working in social media, this is the case, is that creating authentic posts is something. So how do you define what is authentic? What does authentic actually look like when we're talking about these kinds of information? Well, this is an interesting study from Sandlin and Pena, and I pulled it because they're essentially working with the demographics that we're a name talking about today, which is younger adults. So they're talking about blogs, but they did a measurement, and what they did is they asked students who were considering to make a choice about what university to go to read the communications collateral and promotional material from a bunch of different universities, and part of that were sort of these testimonials or blogs by students in those institutions. And so one of the measures that they had was whether or not they were considered to be authentic. And what they found is that the higher authenticity that content was rated at, the more that content actually influenced choice. So there was a correlation between authenticity and choice influence. In other words, the more I think that this is authentically speaking to me, the more I actually have, the more it's impacting me in terms of my decision making. Now, maybe authenticity is just another fancier word for ethos, and it goes back to what Aristotle has said. But I think it goes beyond that, because part of what authenticity is on social media is oftentimes disclosure about backstage information. So I think there's a tendency to be very again, controlled about what we disclose in risk communication, and what authenticity is that you're actually showing things that would otherwise maybe be off message. And I think, for example, narratives of people who are younger, who have suffered from COVID, that are legitimately telling their story without any kind of framing on it from the point of view, may speak more effectively to people than to try to have more of a sort of traditional interview, right? But to have them actually relate that sort of backstage, what was it like that they had, what was the feeling that they had. And we see these kind of stories show up, it creates empathy. But I think that backstage information, or that sort of disclosure, is really important. The other one that they found is that feelings, both positive and negative, when people relied on affect, right, in their relationship in their relating of their experience, that had an influence on the readers and the audience as being understanding something as being authentic, right? Because you're disclosing not just positive messaging but also negative messaging. So again, do I have a solution here? No, but I feel like there's a changing of the ecology in terms of how media functions. So there needs to be a shift in the way in which we think about risk communication, and we look for ways to study how we can change the presentation and whether or not we can incorporate maybe more authentic communication, risk communication that has therefore more ability to catch attention in this attention economy. And I'm going to borrow a quote. And again, this talk was really born out of a variety of conversations. And at the end, I'll kind of list all the folks who I reached out to ask, their opinion on things. But this is from a colleague of mine at Royal Roads University, Dr. Jagris Hodson, and she writes this, and I put it here because I think it's a good thing to think about. The problem is that government and public health communicators are generally using quote unquote control the message tactics to reach people. YouTube press conferences and broadcast style Twitter feeds that stay on message really aren't going to work. They come across as tone deaf and inauthentic. Instead, communicators actually need to go where young people are, TikTok or Instagram, and listen to them, then talk to them like human beings rather than talking to them like publics. And I think, again, from what Dr. McLennan was talking about yesterday, the need for the government to change their MO in terms of we can't respond to people outside of regular business hours, and we're gonna answer phones and respond to emails, but to recognize that actually there is other channels and other platforms, and there's other expectations on those platforms. When you direct message somebody, you expect a fairly quick response to that direct message. And again, studies in terms of customer service, and I know we're not talking about the same thing here, but in a way we are, right? When we send a customer service complaint on Twitter as a direct message and we don't hear anything from that company for more than, like, if we don't get something back within the next 15 minutes, we consider them to be non-responsive. So what this means is that the more channels of communication that we have, the more channels the communication people are going to use. And if we don't properly respond in a dialogical way to people on those channels, then we're going to come across as being non-caring, and we're going to lose the ability to message with them and to answer their questions, and hopefully to provide them with good information about health choices. And so I think sometimes organizations are happy to create a Twitter account or a TikTok account, and then it sits at the bottom of their page, but then they don't actually have the human resources to manage those properly. And I think, again, if we're taking seriously the challenges of communicating with a public that is largely not on traditional media, that means that there has to be resources put into platforms that seem perhaps frivolous, like TikTok, but obviously becomes super important when we're trying to reach demographics that are on no other platform and that consume their media largely through these types of platforms. So dialogue is important. Social media creates the opportunity for dialogue, and if all we're doing is broadcasting messages, then we're actually violating audience expectations about what that platform can offer. And so it has to be both authentic, but it also has to look for ways to be dialogical. And I think the other thing, and the last thing that I'm going to say, and then we'll open it up for questions, is that I think there's oftentimes a reduction of younger generations as being only virtual. It's weird. I think we all do it. We have these sort of stereotypes about different generations, right? And they kind of are stereotypical, straw figures, right? Because obviously if you know people, they're different, and be like, oh, whatever. But I think oftentimes when the media, traditional media, speaks of younger generations, there's a sense that they're fully virtual, right? Like that they're sort of a virtual entity. And Manuel Castells writing like way back in 2011 and speaking to sort of things like the Arab Spring, he makes this really interesting observation, which I think is more important now than then for obvious reasons. But nobody who is on a social network every day is still the same person. It's an online offline interaction, not an esoteric virtual world. So what I read into that quote is, we enter in and out of social media and virtual worlds so like fluidly now, right? Like I'm a living body right now, speaking to literally my computer screen, and you're receiving it from a computer screen. But the idea that you're just what's on Zoom, or I'm just what's on Zoom, misses the composite of who we are as entities. And to believe that we're completely fully separate from that entity that exists online is also wrong. And that the online entity is separate from our lived world is wrong. So what that means in terms of messaging, again, and I think I reached out to Dr. Ryan from Mount Royal, and he makes some really good points. He says, you can't just essentialize these groups as being the same. Not every person who's 20 years old is the same, right? And we know that when we see them and we interact with them, when we see them as our, in the workplace or in our families, we know that they're different. But there's an essentializing process that occurs, and I think that that's a dangerous tendency when we're talking about risk communication, is that not to remember that there are a variety of different lived experiences out there. The other one is to recognize those economic and social contexts. So to recognize that risk means different things for different demographics and for different people within those different demographics. So for people who are 20 to 24 or 25, and they're working in a bar or a restaurant, COVID means that they go from having a lot of tips to no tips, to being on CERB, to coming off of CERB because they have to be off of CERB. The Canadian Economic, what is it called? Recovery, whatever. You all know what CERB means, right? And if you don't, then someone can put the acronym in the chat box for me, because I can't remember what it stands for. But basically, the government subsidy for if you couldn't collect EI quick enough, and so you're on it, you're off it. But they're frontline workers. Who's in the grocery store? Who's working? Who's serving at bars and restaurants that are open, and they're forced to work in situations where they probably wouldn't want to work, and they're putting themselves at risk, right? So, and their economics are being impacted, right? So, this is causing strain and emotional strain on people in ways in which isn't necessarily being put forward when we say, oh, well, how do we communicate risk about COVID to those groups? Well, their understanding of COVID is completely different. It for the vast majority, and like I started off with, it's about economics. It's about economics, and it's about disruption of their daily life, and it's not a threat to their own personal safety for most of them, right? As we know right now, and I'm sure Dr. Hinshaw would probably have other things to say to that, but I think that's the perception. And I think part of what we as communicators have to do is that we recognize that perception is as important, if not more important, than reality, right? It's about the perceptions. And so it's important for us to recognize the realities, because those realities shape the perceptions of something like risk. And then I think the other thing that we can look to, and again, this is borrowing from Dr. Ryan, is to say, these people don't live in virtual spaces. It's not just a question of reaching them through TikTok. There's other places that they live. They live in households. They live in universities. They live in jobs. They live in families. And so these offline relationships are also places of influence. So we shouldn't downgrade the fact that messaging, risk communication in those institutional contexts where these people spend a lot of time is really important. It's not just about being on a virtual communication platform. It's about an integrated an integrated approach to variety of different spaces, literally physical spaces that these people find themselves on a day-to-day basis. And so, as I said, this is not in any way a scientifically proven or social scientifically measured. This was sort of born out of my own interest, looking at what was happening and out of conversations with colleagues at Royal Roads, colleagues at Mount Royal, people, recent graduates from undergraduates, folks like Ben who have a wealth of experiential and academic knowledge about crisis communication and risk communication, and people who are practicing these in local settings, like in a city of Vernon or places like that. So these are the folks that sort of gave me their ideas, and I kind of synthesized them in some ways. But by no means, if there's anything offensive in there, I believe it's coming from me, not them. And anything brilliant is from them and not me. So I really am appreciative to the folks who kind of allowed me to pick their brain for this talk, and I'm happy to close off there the presentation part. I know that kind of takes it right to the hour, but maybe if there's a couple of questions, I don't know, Ben, we're kind of at the time frame, so I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, can you see the Q&A box, sir?
Yeah, I see there's one question in there.
If you address that one, and then you and I have a date.
Okay. I hope you're paying. Okay, so it says, today we see governments relying on traditional media to broadcast lengthy press conferences to the web. Media then condenses it into a story, posts it on social. My teens have no idea who any of the doctors are, yet have questions. Should organizations be moving away from traditional press conferences that use lots of resources and appear not to be working at reaching young populations? And I think, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's both. I think that the reality of it is that someone like Dr. Hinshaw is in a situation where she needs to communicate not just to the people who are getting their information largely from cable news, and there's still people who are doing that, and they're over 45 or 50. That's who's watching cable, and that information is necessary. So we can't just stop those, but we have to look at ways in which people like your teenagers, the people who are living in your house, are getting that information, and looking for ways in which that can be communicated to them on platforms that they're going to get. And I think also recognizing, and I'm sorry to say this, Tim, but I think recognizing our own complicit, like our own responsibility in that system of communication, which is to also be the source of information for them and to provide information, because we care about them, we love them, we have other people who we care about and love, and this is an important element. I don't think that we can solely rely upon the platforms and the crisis communication professionals to communicate good information. I think we have to look to teachers, parents, bosses, places of employment, universities. These have to also be on message, and we have to kind of all pull together. This isn't just an organizational problem. It's a societal problem, and I think we all have to kind of step up, and I'm sure that you do. But I think that we have to rely on good information and also be beacons and communicators ourselves of that information.
That's amazing, Chase. Dr. Remillard, thank you so much. I know when I led the PR team for the city of Calgary, it was always a big topic of discussion about which platforms do we choose to engage on. And, so many of the leadership is hung up on the traditional Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. We thought we were going to do something fun by, trying to engage with a younger audience by using a Britney Spears GIF. And we were quickly instructed to take that down because that did not represent the brand of the business unit that we were trying to express. So it's something that the type of research that you're doing, and with your colleagues at Royal Roads and Mount Royal, that type of research I think will just continue to arm us with the argument to go back to the leadership teams to say there is a need, there is a desire, and there is proven rationale on why we should be on these other channels. So thanks for the work you're doing, and thanks for continuing to be a part of our gang.
My pleasure. And you can distribute my email. And if there's folks that want to be in touch and ask questions, I'm happy to answer them offline or on another forum.
Great. Thanks so much, Chase.
Thank you.
Quick 5-minute break. And the CCRC team here in Calgary recently went to TEDx YYC. And we were actually sitting in the car grading the speakers. And we heard our next speaker, Sweta Chakraborty, and instantly fell in love with her passion, her desire, and her brain. And within the next day, she graciously agreed to join us here. So Sweta is coming up in just 5 minutes. And so we're so looking forward to that conversation. So just be back in 5 minutes.